Now, tonight's event is very special. When we programmed this event, we started with the question of how film and television help perpetuate harmful stereotypes that are contributing to the anti-Asian racism that has been on the rise with the pandemic. And so very quickly, we realized that it would be incredible to hear directly from the author of one of the most groundbreaking works of fiction on this issue. So the discussion tonight will focus on the fantastic book by Charles Yu called Interior Chinatown, for which he won the National Book Award. You can see the little seal right there. This book has a very innovative format. It's written like a TV or a film script, and the characters really expose what life is like for Asian Americans and how racism operates in society. So it's a fantastic book. I recommend you all go get to your favorite independent bookstore and get it immediately. We do have many copies at VPL, but there's a long list of holds. Also, it's the kind of book that you'll want to underline and keep in your bookshelf. So I highly recommend you get a copy or two, give one to a friend. Now, without further ado, introduce today's speakers. Kevin and Charles, can you please join me on stage? Hello. Nice to see you both.
Hi.
Hi. Hello, hello.
Hello. Charles Yu is the author of 4 books and the winner of the 2020 National Book Award for Fiction for Interior Chinatown. He received the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 Award and was nominated for 2 Writers Guild of America Awards for his work on the HBO series Westworld. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And Kevin Chong is an assistant professor of creative studies in creative. He's the author of 6 books of fiction and nonfiction, most recently the novel The Plague. His creative nonfiction and journalism have recently appeared in The Guardian, The Times Literary Supplement, The Rumpus, and the South China Morning Post. So what we're going to do now is they're going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then they're going to take questions from the audience. So for the audience, I want to ask you all to please use the Q&A button to submit your questions instead of just the chat. It makes it really easy for us to manage them if you put them in the Q&A button, and then they won't get buried in the chat. But for those of you who are wondering what I'm talking about with the Q&A button, don't worry, the chat is totally fine if you're more comfortable putting them in the chat. We'll figure it out. Okay, let's get this conversation. Okay. Kevin, take it away.
Thanks, Jorge. I was so excited to get this invitation a couple of weeks back because Interior Chinatown was a book that I basically inhaled like when it first came out, and revisiting it reminded me of how innovative it is, how it speaks to the experience of so many people, including myself, about these sort of forces that shape Asians living in North America, Asian Americans, Asian Canadians, and how this book manages to be like, to bring in so much about, you know, this history of oppression and to speak about race, but also to be very, very specific and moving in particular. Charles, my first question is, Interior Chinatown was published just before the pandemic and a spate of anti-Asian attacks and rhetoric. What has been the reaction to the book, and how does it compare to your expectations leading up to it, or even right after publication?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And I'm excited to be here, excited to be talking with you. We both have something in common, which is we have the other one's book as a background. This is the cover of The Plague by Kevin Chong.
Thank you.
So it's interesting because we both wrote books about things that then became like prescient, or the books became like, I don't know, inadvertently kind of like predictive, I guess, in a way. I don't know if you would consider your book about a plague exactly, but we then had the pandemic. So, because your book came out shortly before, right? Or a couple of years before?
A couple of years before, yeah.
Yeah. I can't, you know, in terms of the timing of Interior Chinatown, it is, you know, obviously it's really hard to continue to hear about attacks, you know, to continue to hear about harassment and discrimination and just this wave of violence that's still happening. And I, you know, writing this book, which took place over several years from like 2013-ish to 2019. I never would have anticipated that. I never would have anticipated any of it. I think the fact that it's relevant to becoming sort of, relevant in terms of like this wave of xenophobia and hate is sadly because I think it's an evergreen issue. I think this is not a new thing, right? This feeling, this undercurrent of sort of xenophobia that still apparently exists. So I think it's not really the genesis of the book itself either. It didn't come necessarily from a place of feeling like I wanted to write something about discrimination exactly. It was more coming from a place of I wanted to tell a story about this character, Willis Wu, about his family, about his mindset growing up in this kind of world that he grows up in. And so the reaction is like, on the one hand, it feels almost like it's just like I kind of stumbled into a lot of it. I wrote a book about a guy, and then it ended up, I get to have conversations like this, and I have the opportunity to talk to a lot of people and learn a lot, and also put my foot in my mouth a lot, which is, I always manage to do that. So.
In researching this interview, I found this quote from you. I feel like I was an existentialist from the age of 5. In other places, I've read about your discussions of race with your children. And my question is, does being racialized, the one Asian in the crowd, make you an existentialist? And then there's like this layer of storytelling, stories about storytelling in a lot of the fiction I've read of yours beyond Interior Chinatown as well.
Yeah, that quote makes me sound so ridiculous. I'm so always be careful when you're talking. I mean, it's not that the journalist who wrote it, Adam Sternberg, I really like him. He quoted it accurately. I actually said that, and it sounds so weird and pretentious, but I don't mean it like I was reading like Camus at the age of 5. Obviously, I hope that's obvious. I mean, what you said, I mean, it's totally that. I was thinking from like a young age about like, where do I, why am I here? Like these questions of like, what's going on? And like, I'd watch cartoons and Bugs Bunny would like walk out of the frame and, erase himself or something. And I just had these sort of, I don't know, bizarre moments of like fourth wall breaking. And so I guess that's what got me thinking. I mean, there was a portion of Interior Chinatown that my editor wisely made me cut out that was all about, the cartoon coyote that's chasing the roadrunner, and just like there's sort of been endless sort of mythic landscape. I really wanted for this to be the long kind of Fantasia dream sequence, because I really think that's just where my head always goes, is like absurdist cartoons. And so that's really what I mean. And I think, to your point, there is something about never feeling like I never saw myself in any stories, physically, but also just psychologically. I never think about like, oh, there's a story and I'm going to be the center of it, or it has anything to do with me. I always had this feeling of watching a story from outside of it or from the margin of it. And so I wrote a bunch of stories when I started writing about characters that were at the margin of their story, that were like Willis, or, I wrote one of my first short stories was called Third Class Superhero. And it's about a guy who's a third class superhero. And so I think in a lot of ways that does maybe lend itself to a certain kind of thinking about what are the stories that we tell? What are the boundaries of those stories? What are the rules of them? Because I'm not thinking of the main character's problems. I'm thinking of like the invisible character's problems always.
In like Interior Chinatown, like Willis is dying to be kung fu guy. He's dying to play this role, which is pretty stereotyped, and I wonder, like, to what extent is being a stereotype a trade-off that Asian Americans, not just actors, have accepted for visibility? And is this something that you encounter when you work with Asian American actors?
Yeah, yeah, I think the way you framed it is right on. It's a trade-off, right? You can have certain slots. So if you want to be part of this, um, then make sure you're up to date on your, martial arts, like keep fit and know that there's only certain kind of prescribed roles. And I think it was that way for a long time. I do know I know a fair number of Asian American actors, both through my work and also because my brother actually is an actor and was from a pretty young age. And so through his experience, through a lot of his friends and people that I met through him, it was interesting to watch that kind of dynamic. Is you'd have these guys and women, but a lot of guys, I guess, because they're my brother's friends, who, in their normal daily life would be outgoing, assertive, the life of the party, sort of who you would think of as the actor in the room, like really funny and interesting and talented. And then, there's this kind of mismatch of like, they'd go in for these parts, and the parts were these very kind of small prescribed roles. Often, like, you get 3 lines on a police procedural, or 3 lines on a drama, or 3 lines on a hospital, and you see this much of the person, and you see a very different person on screen. You see what was written, which is either maybe a quiet, hardworking, diligent person, or a gangster or something. And I think something about taking that whole person and then squeezing it down to these 3 lines. There's something that kind of seeped in about that, for me, and just, I don't know, I guess years later, I ended up writing a book about it, but it did stick with me, like the mismatch between who these creative people were and then what ends up on screen, what ends up the portrayal that millions of people see.
I'm glad you mentioned your brother, because like, I have to say, like, your brother is Kelvin Yu, an actor, and his recurring role in Master of None, like, is one of like my favorite sort of Asian American roles. Like, he has this episode in which the main character Dev and his character, they both sort of try to relate to their immigrant fathers, and it was one of the most authentic sort of like depictions of immigrant life that I've seen. And I wonder whether it's because the writers of the show are Asian, and like, how I'm just curious about how it is, like, as a TV writer, working with like Asian American actors, working with non-Asian American actors. Like, do you have to bring yourself? Do you have to assert your presence as the Asian American in the writing room?
Yeah, it's a great question, and yes, I love that episode. It's a weird, not contradiction. It's like a weird tension, I guess, between wanting to be authentic and wanting to use this platform of television, a mass medium, that will reach many more people than any of my books have or ever will, probably. And so being conscious of, okay, there's an opportunity here, and if there's an Asian character in the story, even though I don't necessarily want to be pigeonholed as the person who writes for that character or the voice of cultural authenticity for that character, I also kind of have a responsibility to, I mean, maybe responsibility is the wrong word, but there's a weird tension between thinking, well, this is not all I am, but also this is part of who I am. So I don't know if that actually answers your question, Kevin. It's sort of like, I find that when I'm in someone else's writer's room, which has been the case so far, it's not my story anyway to steer. So often I'm trying to do what I can to help find the vision of the show and the showrunner. But yeah, I mean, I think there have been times where I felt like I had to speak up. I had to either check something or provide context or nuance or experience where maybe the room didn't really have it. Because I mean, I've been the only Asian person in all of the rooms I've been in, with one exception, which was Westworld, where one of my bosses is of Asian descent. But yeah, it's a weird pressure of like, I'm a writer first, I'm a person. Well, I'm not a writer first, I'm a person first, and then I'm an American, right? And I'm a writer, and then I'm of Asian descent. So I don't think I answered your question, but I talked too long.
I want to get back to Interior Chinatown.
Yeah.
Your protagonist, Willis, strives to be Kung Fu guy, as I mentioned earlier. I'm a Bruce Lee fan, and Bruce Lee's mentioned in Interior Chinatown. In what ways is he a blessing and a curse for Willis?
That's a good question. I think he's a blessing because he proves that to Willis and to every other, Asian in this world, this book world, that Asians can be cool. Like, I remember when I was a kid, literally that is what it took. There were no other people that, really, I'm trying to think. Yeah. I mean, I'm born in 76. Like, I can't think of someone else who is like, no matter where you were, no matter what kids, it's like nobody's going to deny that Bruce Lee is awesome, right? And so at least we had one person like that, one hero. I think it's mostly a blessing. The curse, I guess, would be that, well, then it's Bruce Lee. Like, you literally have no other, like, it's either you're like a living kind of, embodiment of perfection and grace and coolness, or you're not. And so that maybe is that drop off from like reality, from ideal to reality is maybe a bit of a curse. Yeah.
Nice. In an essay of yours I read, you talk about being a bad Asian. That's a concept that resonated with me. It's an experience that's partly based on filial impiety, and for some of us, it's also tied to just being a bad Asian and returning to Asia. Being a bad Asian often turns into turning away from Asianness. How have you resisted being a bad Asian in your writing, or how have you like leaned into it?
Yeah, I feel like I was a very bad Asian, but I also resist that term too. I resist all kinds of ways. I'm just a bundle of contradictions. Because I think for a long time I actually shied away from writing explicitly. Like, I didn't talk about race. Like, my characters were all this weird kind of stick figure, because, and I'm talking about my first few books, first 2 or 3 books, really. Before this book, I've only written 4. So, and I actually had somebody come up to me at a reading in Boston and say, I feel like you're kind of shying away from this. Like, your characters in this one book of mine, my first novel, are obviously from Taiwan. That's clear. What's like, you reference, but I never say the word Taiwan. I don't talk about, like it in any explicit terms, but it's clear if you know what to look for, I guess. And this reader was like, why do you think you're doing that? And that sort of like spun me into a spiral of self-doubt and introspection, And so in that way, I guess I'm, I don't know. I think there's a whole lot of, I don't know what the word is, anxiety about, and I'm not sure where it comes from, to be honest. I think there's I have complicated feelings about, even about having written this book, to be honest. I just feel like it's kind of like out there. And a lot of it is things that make me uncomfortable. And so, yeah, putting it in fiction helps. Willis Wu doesn't exist. His parents aren't my parents, but I don't know. I think writing this book was almost like a way I could confront a whole lot of things that I was interested in as a person, but also as a writer. Yeah. And it's not like it solved them. It's like, that's not what the book is for. It's just a story.
Thank you. You also wrote in Harper's about Donald Trump's ability as a world builder. Like,
Right.
And a lot of your writing draws from like science fiction sort of context and comic book context, and in world building, that's like a major sort of element of sort of creating this imaginary world for your characters to inhabit. Trump's inherited and expanded a world in which there's a rigged election and one's job will be taken away by a woke mob. To what extent do you think this world building is responsible for anti-Asian violence?
Yeah, it's a good question. And to just provide a little bit of background, I guess, on the piece is, there was the conceit of the essay is basically like that one skill that former President Trump really excels at is world building in the way we think of like a science fiction or fantasy writer who can really create an alternate reality that stands up, holds up, that makes fandom want to build around it, and that's how I think of people that subscribe to that, is almost as if it's like, we don't have to worry about, does anyone think this is plausible or real? We just have to enjoy being in this fiction. And that's a separate skill from actually grappling with reality or the complicated business of running a federal government. It's being a fiction writer, basically. That was my kind of, conceit. Like, he's good at this. And to answer your question specifically, Kevin, it's, I think of that as part of that skill is creating a villain, is one of, and so I really think that he understood, whether it's intuitively or not, and he wasn't the only one, but he was the main one who said, no, it's hard to get mad at, a virus, a bunch of DNA or RNA. It's like, it's hard to get mad at something as abstract or invisible. And so how do you take energy that's already in the system, energy of fear or xenophobia, and then harness it or shape it, towards a particular group of people? And so that is what I think happened. Yeah.
We were talking about world building, and as I mentioned earlier, like a lot of your work, including like third class superhero, borrows from science fiction, borrows from hard science, borrows from comic books. Was there ever a stage in your writing life where you wrote strictly, tried to write straight science fiction or write a comic book? And like, what inspired you to try to create these sort of hybrid forms? Was that just your natural mode?
There's definitely, I still try to write things more straight down the middle, whatever that means. And I just find myself getting into hybrid mode, as you said. I think to me, and I don't know if you find this in your own, but my first job is to keep myself interested enough so I don't get up, go get a snack or check the internet. And often that happens when I just like the last sentence I wrote. I'm like, oh, that's an interesting sentence. Of course, I'm always thinking like, oh, what is this saying? Like, like the important, what is the message, or like, what's the structure? But really for me, it comes down to, am I making interesting sentences? And often, for whatever reason, what happens is my sentences really bore me if I'm trying to write in one mode, because I'm usually not writing from a real place. I'm writing as if like through a ventriloquist dummy. I'm like pretending that I'm a more serious writer than I am. And I'm making kind of like dead sentences. And then I'm like, I stop all that and I'm like, just write what you know, which is like a lot of TV and a lot of video games and, a lot of, just stuff that accumulated in my head over the years. So that's what comes out.
This is maybe like more of an esoteric writerly question, but in terms of like your world folding in, and what's remarkable in Interior Chinatown is how you have the world of the TV show and the world of Willis, and they kind of like fold into each other. Like, is that something that you plot out? Is that something you think in advance? Like, you know, in TV you have to outline and do your beat sheets, but is that something you can do as a prose writer and someone who writes in without really a formula? It seems like, or an established formula.
I do try to plot things out, and it doesn't usually work, but I feel like it's a necessary like part, like the failed attempts to plot are like necessary work for me. You know what I mean? Like I look back at some of the early drafts and like notes I took in journals, and it's like, I laugh at it because it's either like overcomplicated. I'm like, it's like I'm as if I were writing Inception. I'm like, and then Willis does this, and then like none of it makes any sense. And then I try things like, then I try things like overall structure of you know, the book. I think what happens though is all of that like plays itself out, and then eventually I just wipe it off my desk, you know, figuratively and literally. It just all goes away. But in the process of that, I did crystallize what really was essential about it. And often it comes out later in a much more sort of simplified form. So I guess my answer is there's a whole bunch of like messy, chaotic half starts, dead ends. And then sometimes there's a breakthrough because I did all of that prep work, you know. Sometimes it doesn't always work.
So it's like part plan, sort of part sort of pantsing, you know, they call it.
Pantsing?
Yeah, like going by the seat of your pants, you know, like
plotters
like and pantsers.
Oh, okay. I like that. That's a good dichotomy.
Yeah. Thank you. What, you know, you were a lawyer just until like several years back, and I was thinking about that. Like when Willis goes on trial, like do you like put on your legal cap, like, and how does your previous career influence your own writing even now?
Yeah, I guess I put on the writer cap a little bit from the safety of like the other side of the bridge, because you know, the whole time I was a lawyer, I always had imposter syndrome. And then when I quit, I finally realized, oh, I kind of like that. I kind of miss parts of being a lawyer. So it was kind of fun to write the book and actually get to do a little bit of research and use some of that. I mean, I definitely learned a great deal. I feel like being a lawyer, I was a lawyer for 13 years. So, you know, it wasn't just like I did it for 18 months or something. I was halfway through my career, or a third of the way through my career, I guess. And I think I became a less lazy person because I was pretty lazy as an undergrad. And so it gave me a bit more stamina, which definitely helps. Especially writing a novel, you know, it's just a marathon. And it also gave me something to write about. I think I live a very boring, we were talking before we started that I'm a homebody and I don't really have any hobbies, and I don't really travel. So I wouldn't have much to write about. And so I think a lot of my books are actually about family and they're about work. I think even Interior Chinatown is really actually kind of weirdly a workplace story of people being Asian professionally. And deep down is a family story, or not deep down, it is a family story. So yeah. And I guess the other thing about being a lawyer is you have to pay a lot of attention to the words. So that helps.
Like I remember reading an interview just recently where you talked about trying to like balance like your legal career and your family life, and how you wrote between like 10 and 12, which I find remarkable. I'm ready to fall asleep around then. And was it an easy transition to being a full-time writer?
No, it's been hard. And I mean, I'm not complaining. this is what I always dreamed of. So I do love it. I mean, I dreamed someday of like being a professor, I thought maybe, and then actually the reality of that, I was like, well, I don't have a graduate degree, and so I would need to publish some books, and so I gave that up. But so this was always the dream, and then when I actually got to start doing it, I realized, oh, now it feels like a job. And now, like, unfortunately, now my job is the thing that I love the most in the world, but it's still my job. That's a weird, complicated. I don't know if you feel the same, but it's a weird, complicated thing to get to do this. I mean, but I also still wake up every day and I'm thrilled to be able to do it. So,
are you balancing writing, TV writing with, your fiction in a way that's productive and useful for you right now?
No, I'm not. I wish I were. It's pretty demanding, and I do carve out a little bit of time every day to write, some fiction, some prose, even if it's just ideas. But it's the TV and stuff is taking up basically all my time at the moment. And, again, I'm not complaining, but it is weird. On the other hand, all those years I was a lawyer, a lot of days I had zero time as well. So I don't know that I would, actually, I do kind of know. I don't know. I know that I'm not super productive if I have 8 to 10 hours a day of writing fiction. I don't need that. I feel like, honestly, an hour, if I'm good, if I'm disciplined and if it's quiet in the house, probably enough, and then reading, and then just life, I guess. I don't know.
You took on screenwriting after being a fiction writer, and obviously Interior Chinatown to some extent reflects that, but are there other ways in which TV writing has sort of shaped your fiction?
It's maybe a little more conscious of the visual, I think. I don't know if that's always a good thing, because I think, fiction can go anywhere, can be anything, can be ineffable, and film and TV cannot be ineffable. They have to be tangibilized at some point. So it's made me a little bit more conscious of that. But it does help. I think it's given me a better sense of structure. I was always a pretty minimalist writer. I'm not a minimalist talker, but I'm a minimalist writer. So I think that helps in TV, but it's made me even more so. I think just every eighth of an inch on the page or whatever, or every eighth of a page is it's like a unit. And now you have to think about, okay, this is taking up time in the story. So if anything, it's made me more conscious of that.
Great. Can I ask you about your adaptation of Americanborn Chinese? That's like a graphic novel that really, made an impact on me a few years when I read it. How's that going? And are there challenges to it that are unexpected? And can you talk more about it?
I can talk a little bit about it, but only to a point, because actually it's my brother Kelvin is the showrunner of that show, and he I think it's out in the news, so I can talk about it. It's going to be a series on Disney Plus, and which is so exciting. And we did co-write the pilot script together, but I am not involved day to day anymore. So I'm excited to see it, because I actually don't know where it went after we wrote that. It's based, as you mentioned, on this really groundbreaking book that means a lot to me too. I would go buy it or check it out from the library, or it's by Jean Wen Yang, and it is brilliant. It uses form, it melds a very innovative form and then kind of breaks form to tell a story about, the experience of this young Chinese American boy, Jin Wang. So it's just a fascinating piece of fiction and also a really touching story that, yeah, it's great. I can't recommend it enough. So, and yeah, I'm excited for the show.
Is there a particular challenge to writing like a on-screen story about an Asian American protagonist? It's different from other experiences writing?
I think so. I think it's challenging. I think it feels like there's a kind of pressure because there still haven't been that many, and we're seeing it more in the last few years, and so, I get to have the luxury of building off of that in whatever I'm doing next, but it still feels like we're kind of hopefully in early days of exploring, what kinds of stories can be told, and so, or not what kinds of stories can be told. It's just hopefully we're in early days of a huge variety of stories coming up, but for now there just haven't been that many. So it feels like all of a sudden going from like invisible on screen 20 years ago, let's say, to now having opportunities like Americanborn Chinese or Shang-Chi or, other Fresh Off the Boat, a whole bunch of things that come out in the last few years, Crazy Rich Asians, where the people of Asian descent are front and center on mainstream Hollywood things. I think that's scary in a way. The visibility can be frightening. I mean, to tie it back to the very beginning, I mean, there's a kind of exposure almost of that comes with being in the spotlight that is a little scary.
Well, thank you. I've got one more question, and I already see a couple of people have entered the questions into the box, and so now I'm just prompting the audience, if they have questions sort of pent up, like to let their keyboards rip. So my final question is that, Chinatown was, a place that Chinese people were forced to live in by law. It was a ghetto, but
Right.
At some point it became a community, became a place of pride. And my question is there strength in numbers? I think about the high concentration of Asians in Vancouver, but it's also the place with the highest incidence of Asian violence, anti-Asian violence in North America. Chinatowns were places where we were offered protection. The progressive, ethnically diverse, well-heeled neighborhood I live in is a different kind of segregation in some ways. Are we in some ways, shielded or inoculated when we are with like-minded people? And to what extent is that sort of safety like false?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's all of that. I think that's so. I won't attempt to give an intelligible answer on all of it, but I think that I respond to a lot of parts of what you said. I think for me, there's a big question, or there's a tension, between, as you mentioned, there's community, there's support, there's strength in numbers, there's literal safety, right? If you know most of the people around, if you know your way around and you're more comfortable, and maybe you know more people that you could speak to language wise, isn't that a strength to have that? And then I guess, and this is through the lens of the book, and I don't mean to bring it back to that, but only to say that to me, the tension would be how do you have the positives of a Chinatown, which can provide support, especially to, let's say, a family or a wave of immigrants that is coming more recently, and maybe as that family gets more, continues to build a life here through generations, maybe doesn't need that kind of community, or that community evolves outwards towards a suburb, right? But how do you have that without then becoming isolated or easily separable? Or how do you then balance that against people saying, well, you know, if you're always in an enclave, are you really trying to be part of this society, of the larger society? You know, isn't part of the immigrant experience not just to remain within a community, but to actually become part of the fabric of the country that that was migrated to, you know? So I don't know. I just said a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that was sort of like my question. So I think you answered it perfectly. I'm going to go into like the Q&A now. There's some really great questions. Baldwin asks, when people of Asian descent are portrayed in popular media, even by members of their own communities, how do we move beyond the tokenistic, trite, and monodimensional characters in culture that are still the norm? Do we need more than just an Asian director to be able to tell more complex stories about our communities?
Thanks, Baldwin. Yeah. I don't know how we move. I mean, yes, I think I feel like there's an opportunity that I haven't seen. And, you know, I'm in my mid 40s. I have been through a couple of cycles of watching American, you know, TV and movies where it's like, oh, maybe things are changing. Oh no, they're not changing. You know, 2 years after some big Asian things comes out, it's as if everybody forgot about it, and those actors so I feel like the last few years feel different. So the way I think we move past tokenistic or, you know, these kind of really prescribed stereotypical roles is through sheer number and through having people who can tell the stories behind the camera, you know, and that means writers, but I think it also means directors. And I think it means people in all kinds of departments, you know, it means executives and producers, like the people who, you know, the gatekeepers, some of the people who really kind of decide what projects go forward or what kind of resources they get. I feel like there are, at least from my experience, a lot of people behind the scenes who are interested in expanding the kinds of stories that we see and telling more nuanced stories. So I am very hopeful that it is changing.
Mm-hmm. Karen asks, I wonder whether or not you feel that there are Asian American or immigration stories that should specifically not be told. Are there stories which readers would find too painful? Or what do you do with stories that are too close to home and your family might feel exposed?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I guess that's different for everyone. I want to be sensitive because I suppose there are probably people that couldn't watch certain kinds of stories, you know, and maybe historical events or violence or, you know, just systemic discrimination or other kinds of traumatic things. The second part of the question, I have that hits close to home for me because I have one novel where I actually named the protagonist with my name, which never do that because your family will definitely think forever and ever that you are writing about them, and it's hard to explain. Like, no, this is metafiction. They're like, then, you know, like still nobody, you know, not a lot of times people won't care to make that distinction. So I think there's a real, like, yeah, there's a reality to that sometimes, of feeling like you put it out there as a writer, and yet the material that feels like it resonates or connects with people often comes from a real place, you know? So I personally don't know where else to get it other than real life.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Wiley asks, or says, Interior Chinatown is brilliant and so fun. How do you arrive at the shape of the story? Did you show early drafts to other writers or friends?
I did not. I showed it to my editor and my agent, and it was a long, slow process. So thank you for reading it. Thanks for the kind words. It took so many forms and shapes, and I failed multiple times, like where I wrote the whole book and just threw it away. So I'm actually someone who doesn't like the first person who reads it after my editor and agent is my wife, but she only really reads it when I'm like almost done with it, because I feel like if she reads it too early on and she doesn't like it, I will lose confidence and never want to finish it. So, I generally don't share things until it's pretty late.
That's like a real sort of schism. I know a lot of writers who like have these sort of groups of beta readers, and then there are some folks who just send it better and no one else, you know. So it's interesting to hear your perspective on that. Andrew asks, what books of any genre or theme have you read in the past year that have impressed you?
Oh, wow. The past year? I really liked, this was not in the past year, but I really liked Kathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings. Mm-hmm. I read a book called What Strange Paradise by Omar El-Akkad, a Canadian writer. Brilliant. And I read J. Caspian King has a book out of essays called The Loneliest Americans. I think that came out last fall. It was great, really incisive. So I learned a lot.
I found like Minor Feelings and Interior Chinatown were like kind of the pandemic books for me, like in a lot of ways, because they wrote about sort of anti-Asian racism at the peak of it. And, you know, I feel like they're both very similar in some ways. They're both from writers who were born in the 1970s, Asian American writers. Kathy Park Hong's book, you know, is essays. But there's the same sort of, maybe it's because I was born in the 70s too, but there's this sort of a take on race, which is like complicated and sort of like from that era. I feel like younger Asians, those who were born in the 90s or the 2000s, are way more quick to assert their identity and talk about it. Maybe it's the internet, maybe it's like where they're growing up, but it's very different. Have you had a chance to talk to Kathy Park Hong about Minor Feelings, or, you know, for her to talk to you about Interior Chinatown?
Yes, actually, we did a Zoom in 2020. And so that was really fun. I mean, it wasn't fun. It was stimulating. It wasn't like we were giggling or anything, but it was me interviewing her about her book. So mostly we're talking about her book. And I remember when her book came out, it was like a month after my book came out. And I just thought, oh my gosh, one, I'm so glad this book exists. And two, I'm so glad this book didn't come out a year ago, because I probably wouldn't have finished my book, because I would have been like, this says a lot of stuff that I'm already, you know, they're very different books, but yeah, it's weird how much that I feel like they're in conversation with each other in some ways.
I feel like we've run through our questions already, you know, unless anyone wants to sort of dive in and ask a question. I think we've run through the audience questions, and they're really insightful questions. And I enjoyed hearing you talk about the books you read and talking about, you know, like how to move beyond tokenism. Interior Chinatown, you know, I'm so grateful for you for writing that book. You know, like you like spoke some powerful truths in a way that was so innovative. You know, I see a last question, so maybe we do have like another 5 or 6 minutes. I was just kind of wrapping it up, but there is a question. That's great. I was just sort of vamping for this person, AC. If an aspiring Asian Canadian / American writer is hoping to be published, would it be better to seek an agent who is also Asian Canadian, Asian American, or to seek the best, quote, agent she can get?
That is a good question. That is very interesting. I think that it's very possible that the person who will love your work the most is not necessarily someone who will be of similar ethnic, you know, or national origin. You know, I I think an editor's job, especially as I understand it, in this day and age, obviously is to edit the book, but also to be the champion for your book, both inside the house and in the world. And that's the person who's going to do that is really someone who gets what you're trying to do. And my editor often gets what I'm trying to do before I know it and better than I know it, to be honest. So I feel like, that's such an important creative marriage in so many ways that I would tend to say that, and I promise I'm not vamping for time. I'm really, it's so hard because that also could be someone having an affinity for your work or your point of view or your worldview could come from being of Asian descent. Maybe they get you partly because of that. But I feel like finding that one right editor, and it doesn't have to be one person for your whole life or your whole career, but when you can find someone like who really loves your work and is passionate about it, go with that person. That's what I would say. So.
That's a nice, encouraging note. I see. Again, it's a real pleasure. This book was amazing. It was really one of my things that got me through the pandemic, and it introduced me to your other books too, which I really appreciate, Charles. Thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you very much for speaking to all the audiences who've attended. I'm really grateful for you for making time for us.
No, thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone for attending. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you, Kevin, for taking the time to do this. And thank you for your work. I'm glad to have been introduced to it as well. And now I have a new person to get to read. I look forward to crossing paths in literary space someday.
I hope so.
Thank you both. This was incredible to watch and to witness. And thank you for so generously sharing your work and your process, Charles and Kevin, for your amazing questions. You both can stay on stage if you want. If you want. I'm just going to wrap up here for everyone. Everyone, thank you for spending your evening with us. Here's the book again. So I encourage everyone, as you heard, to go and get it from your local bookstore. You're going to love it if you haven't read it. If you want to watch this event again, or if you have friends or family who must watch this event, we have good news. We're live streaming this event to the library's YouTube channel, so you can find it there. We're going to share the link to the YouTube playlist that we use for these cultural events so that you can see it there. We also we will have the replay listed on the Uplift Asian series landing page, which we'll share the link again. So there's two ways to get to this replay if you forget. So thank you for that. Now, I have a favor to ask you. As we mentioned at the beginning of this event is funded by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. And it's really important for us, for this funding, these events are reaching newcomers and permanent residents of Canada. So we're going to share a link to a citizenship status form. And we would love it if you took a second to fill it out. It doesn't matter if you are Canadian or if you're an immigrant or whatever your status is. It's useful for us to know who attends our events. So please take a second to fill it out. We'll remind you in an email tomorrow in case you forget. So a second favor is for us, we also love it if you give us feedbacks about events in general. And that's because we're a public institution. So our job is to make sure that our programs reflect what our audience wants. You're paying for them with your taxes. So we really want to make sure that we're giving you incredible programming. So that's our job. So please fill out our feedback survey that we're going to share online right now in the chat. And that'll give us a sense of how you enjoyed this program. And I promise you, we actually read these things. It doesn't go into a dark hole of the internet where no one pays attention to it. We actually look at your comments and adapt our programming. We also have a newsletter, of course. So if you want to find out about new things like this, just sign up for our newsletter in case you don't get it. And follow us on our socials because that will cite some of our best events. Now, we have a bunch of wonderful upcoming events for this series, and we're just going to tell you about two of them, and then we're going to wrap up. So on next Tuesday, we're hosting a panel conversation about the present and future of Vancouver's historic Chinatown. So remember what Kevin is talking about. So we're going to invite 4 people who are going to talk about what's happening in the neighborhood right now with the pandemic and how they're working to reinvigorate Chinatown. And then on Wednesday, the next day, we're hosting a performance and a conversation with 5 Filipinx spoken word poets. And they're going to talk about how they use language and their poetry to explore issues of identity to overcome adversity. So again, we're going to share the link to the series again. It's called Upliftation. Please bookmark it so you don't forget where it is. Share it with your friends. Tell everyone that it's happening. So that's it for tonight. Thank you all for coming. And thank you for enjoying this and for your very thoughtful questions and your respect. So thank you really a lot for that. We're going to keep the event open for another minutes after I leave, just so that you can click on the mountain of links that we left you on the chat. But in the meantime, have a wonderful night. I hope to see you next Tuesday, and thanks for coming. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.